Hi everyone, welcome to FtBCon3. This panel is called Reasonable Relationships. How does our skepticism influence our romantic or non-romantic relationships? Wes will be moderating, so I'll let him take over now.
Hi, this is Wesley Fenza. I write for livingwithinreason.com. I also speak on polyamory and relationships at conferences around the country. You can next see me at Polyliving, which is the weekend of February 20th in Philadelphia. With me are Chana Messinger, Franklin Veaux, and, as you know, Miri Mogilevsky. If you guys would like to give a short introduction, go ahead.
Sure. I'm Chana Messinger. I am a math high school teacher living in Pittsburgh, and I also blog at The Merely Real. I identify as poly and have spoken about relationships on panels like this before, including at Skepticon and at FtBCon, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I'm Franklin Veaux. I am the co-author of the polyamory book More Than Two. I write about polyamory and BDSM and other relationship things, and I particularly write about ethics in relationships, and I will also be speaking at Polyliving in Philadelphia.
All right, and you should all buy a copy of More Than Two. It's amazing.
I actually didn't really get to introduce myself.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Wes.
Everyone knows who you are.
So I'm Miri, and my blog is Brute Reason on the Free Thought Vlogs Network. I write about a lot of things, but I do tend to focus a lot on relationships, communication, sexuality, and things like that. I'm also in my second year of a master's program in social work.
All right, so the name of the panel is Reasonable Relationships. And what we're going to be discussing is how certain ways of thinking, and specifically logical fallacies, can affect our brains and how that affects our relationships. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the sunk cost fallacy, which is actually the inspiration for the idea for this panel. The sunk cost fallacy, and I'm just going to give a quick Wikipedia definition for each one of the terms that we're discussing in case you don't know of it. So the Wikipedia defines the sunk cost fallacy as, it says the term sunk cost fallacy has been used to describe the phenomenon where people justify increased investment in a decision based on the cumulative prior investment, despite new evidence suggesting the cost starting today of continuing the decision outweighs the expected benefit. And one of the classic examples of the sunk cost fallacy is that a person who buys a non-refundable movie ticket will feel obligated to go to the movie when the time comes to go, even if they don't really feel like it, because they want to avoid wasting money. And it's a fallacy because the money's spent either way. The only difference is whether they're going to go or whether they're not going to go. And I feel like this affects our relationships in profound ways. But I'd like to hand it over to the panelists to see what you guys think about that.
So I'm in a cabin in Washington right now and working on a memoir, and part of the memoir that I'm working on is the experiences that I had in my relationship with my ex-wife. She and I were together for 18 years. We were in a polymono relationship for that entire time, but she really didn't like polyamory, and so she imposed a lot of sort of rules and restrictions on my other relationships that turned out to be extremely destructive and extremely hurtful to my other partners. And yet, I remained in that relationship with her for 18 years. And I really do think that a big part of that was just I was thinking, I've been with her for 5 years, I don't want to throw that away. I've been with her for 7 years, I don't want to throw that away. I've been with her for 10 years, so I don't want to throw that away. And so there kept being this sort of idea of all of this investment that I had made in the relationship that sort of obligated me to continue the relationship, even when it was costly to me and costly to other people, because I wasn't looking at, was the relationship serving me now? I was looking at, how much have I invested in this relationship so far? And looking back, had I not been trapped in that cycle, I think I would have probably ended the relationship much earlier, and we both would have been happier for it.
I think relationships are a domain in which the sunk cost fallacy is like sort of especially harmful and profound. And I think there's two main reasons for that. One is that the length of a relationship is one of the main ways we have in society of measuring how good it is. So we sort of assume that the longer it lasts, the more serious it is, the better it is, the more rewarding it is. And the ideal is a relationship that lasts for your entire life, that is a marriage that, never ends. And, that doesn't really take into account the actual quality of it, but it makes people feel like they have to keep it going, or else it's not even going to mean anything just because it ended. The other thing that makes this difficult is that, especially if you pay attention to certain sources and outlets, you'll hear a lot of this rhetoric that says that people these days just throw their relationships away too easily. They just jump to divorce when they should have tried to make it work, or they just break it off rather than, trying to make it work. And I don't know, it's hard to say. Are there people who let go of their relationships too easily? I mean, maybe. What is too easily? We don't know what's in their heads. We don't know if it would have been worthwhile, if the cost of keeping the relationship going would have been worthwhile. But you do hear this a lot, especially from certain sort of like conservative sources.
Yeah, and I'm sure this intersects with other fallacies as well, but I know when I'm in a long-term relationship that may or may not be working, one of the things I think is, I don't want to throw what I've already done away, but also the thought of, quote-unquote, starting all over again, sort of starting from scratch and building up to the kind of seriousness and ease and connection is really daunting. And so, like with the movie ticket, right? You could think like, oh God, I could like figure out another way to spend my evening, but that would take so much emotional investment that I might as well just do the easy thing and do what I had planned anyway. And I think that's in some ways rational. Like sometimes it is easier, and that's the better choice for you. But I really like the script that Franklin brought up of asking yourself at any point, is what next step is best for everyone involved.
So, do you guys think there is any intrinsic value to a relationship that's had a shared history that goes back a long time? Do you guys think that does add any value going forward, and that should be a consideration in the decision whether to continue the relationship or what kind of relationship to have in the future?
So it does for me personally, but that's not unique to romantic or sexual relationships. It also applies to friendships and family relationships. And the reason is that I'm someone who, at least at this stage in my life, undergoes a lot of transition, both in terms of who I am as a person and what I'm doing and where I'm living. And it has been really helpful and grounding for me to have people in my life who've been in it for a long time, and who've sort of seen where I've been and where I've come from. But they don't need to be my partner. So an example of this is one of my roommates right now. We were really good friends for 4 years, then we dated for 2 years, then we broke up, and it's been several years, and we're still good friends, and in fact, we're roommates. It's really cool to have someone living with me who knew me when I was 14. Almost nobody else in my life does, and he sometimes provides a perspective that no one else can. But that doesn't mean that we had to have kept dating, and I'm glad we didn't. It needed to end, and I like where it is now.
On the other hand, I mean, I think it's often the case that breaking up with someone really transforms that relationship into something less close, less intense, that involves a lot less sharing of one's lives. It certainly doesn't have to, and I really respect people who make it work when they want to. But that means that you definitely have lost someone. And I think especially for people who invest a lot of themselves in a relationship, especially, for instance, monogamous people, where maybe your partner becomes the person you spend most of your time with, you definitely lose something. Even if the relationship as a romantic structure isn't working, you lose something by losing someone who is that close to you. Leah Labresco, who writes on Unequally Yoked at Pathos, spoke about this recently.
And two, relationships are... Well, we engage in relationships because we benefit from them, right? I mean, we are social animals. We benefit from having people close to us. We benefit from having these connections. And so I don't think that those are things that we should throw away lightly. I think there's value to a healthy relationship, and I think that it takes time to learn another person. So it takes time to really invest in a person, to invest in a relationship, and to be able to get sort of these benefits and this mutual sharing, this mutual intimacy. And intimacy is worth having. So it's not something to be discarded lightly.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard about this in the past is that the history of a relationship doesn't mean the relationship is valuable. The value of the relationship, at least from my perspective, comes from what's going to be happening in the future. But everything that's come before is evidence of that. And I think it's really hard to know what your relationship's going to be in the future if you don't have a pretty substantial history. Getting to know people is hard, and predicting the future is hard. And you need to have as much information as possible, and a shared history really enables you to do that. So I think there's some wisdom to the idea that a long history with a person is valuable, and that you shouldn't throw that away for something that maybe you don't have as much of a history with, or that throwing away a relationship that's that established is sort of tragic, or is something you should really think about. But at the same time, I think the decision should be forward-looking and not just rely on what's come before. And yeah, if you guys, so any thoughts you guys have before we move on to the next fallacy, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, although I still want to bounce off something that Miri said, which is the question might be less what's the most important feature, and so we all sort of agree that there's value to the past, but that we should be looking forward. But what do most people need to hear? And I think I agree with Miri on this, that the dominant cultural norm is be careful of throwing away, is love the sunk cost fallacy with all your heart. And so maybe what people need to hear more of, even if we agree that the past is important, is it's okay to let go.
Yeah, one of the things that I do in my relationships now is, since I'm polyamorous, I have a policy that I won't get involved with somebody who's not already poly, but also I won't get involved with somebody who doesn't already have multiple other partners, because, like Wes was saying, well, we want an idea about how we can be treated, and, you don't actually necessarily need to have an established history to get some idea of that. I can look to somebody's existing partnerships and relationships and say, well, that might reflect how they are in relationship, and that might be how they treat me.
Yeah, poly brings a really interesting mix into this, because I think poly people a lot tend to think of ourselves as like throwing out the script and thinking things rationally out from the beginning. But in some sense, I think poly makes us much more susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy, because there's nothing wrong with dating this person. I can keep dating other people, but so even if this isn't working, you should keep seeing just to see what'll happen, right? You shouldn't throw something away.
Yeah, monogamy definitely forces you in some ways, and I mean, obviously there are monogamous people who sort of string along relationships that aren't working anyway, but if there is someone else that you're interested in, and often there is, even monogamous people might be interested in multiple people, it really forces you to make that choice, like, do I still want to be with this person? Because if I stop being with them, I can be with this person instead. And I think for me, like, the reason I'm poly is because overall that has more negatives than positives, but I think that is a positive.
Yeah, and this sort of ties in with another fallacy that I wasn't planning on discussing, but it's sort of the fallacy behind the sunk cost fallacy, which is loss aversion, which just means that people in general tend to value losses more than gains. So, like, losing $100 is worse than the benefit you get from gaining $100. And that's sort of the reason behind the sunk cost fallacy. But do you guys have any other examples of how just the idea of loss aversion, and that we don't view losses and gains the same as how that might affect our relationships?
That's really kind of tricky, because there are a couple of different ways that you can approach the idea of love and relationships. One is kind of a starvation model, where you start from the assumption that, oh, it's hard to find partners, it's difficult to find love, connection is really rare. And the other is sort of an abundance model, where you say, well, there's 7 billion people in the world. No matter how picky I am, there are many, many people out there. There's lots and lots of opportunity for love and connection. If you start with a starvation model of love, then the loss aversion becomes huge. In fact, it can become the dominant force in your decision to stay in a relationship, because, all right, this relationship is flawed, it's not working for me, but oh my God, it is so hard to find somebody that if I let go of this relationship, I will be alone forever.
But that's not just a model, right? That's an empirical question of, like, I mean, I think the reality is that for some people, people who are conventionally attractive or don't have really rare kinks or whatever, love is more abundant. It's a terrible thing to say, but like I know Dan Savage is not like a popular figure, and like for some really good reasons. But one of the things he says is like some people who have, for instance, really rare kinks need to face up to how rare that is, and either settle for someone they can try to negotiate with, or maybe be alone for a long time, and that's kind of the reality of the situation. So I guess, Franklin, I wonder what you'd say to the fact that that reality may be the case for some people.
So it's been my experience, certainly, and it's definitely been my observation as well, that the model you have tends to influence how successful you are, which is why I call it a model.
Sure.
Like,
Sure.
I have some really unusual tastes, really unusual, but I do not have problems finding partners, and I think a big part of that is because I believe that opportunities for love and connection are abundant, I just go about my life being happy. I don't, pursue everybody, with this sort of air of desperate puppy dog. I am not desperately searching all the time, and desperation is a huge turnoff. So I think that what happens is, I start from the assumption that, well, if I am only interested in and compatible with 1% of 1% of 1% of 1% of 1% of the population, that's still, what, 70,000 people? I mean, that's kind of an embarrassment of riches, right? So, there was a guy in Germany a few years back who put out a personal ad in a paper that he was looking for a lover that he could have sex with, kill, and eat. And he had to sort through all of the replies. If somebody with tastes that exotic can find a lover, I can find a lover.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always think about with loss aversion is, Franklin, you're always advising people that we should move in the direction of greatest courage. And I think that relates not to just leaving relationships, but also what we're going to do in our relationships, and that we can take risks, and that things might not be as scary as we think they are, and that to realize that we have this inbuilt loss aversion into us, and that we may be overestimating our losses and undervaluing our potential gains from taking any sort of risk in our relationships, whether it be leaving or just changing how we do things.
I do want to speak to Chana's point a little bit more, because I think it's true that a lot of people, good people, interesting people, do have trouble finding partners for all sorts of reasons. But I think where this comes in is that a lot of people don't realize that there are worse things than being single, and that is being in a bad relationship that's not working for you. So I wonder how much of this is just getting people to let go of that fear a little bit, and to realize that, like, if your relationship isn't working, hanging on to it because you're afraid of being single isn't actually doing you any good. Because even though the idea of not having a partner might be terrifying, you might find that it's better than being in a relationship where you're constantly irritated or angry or disrespected or having your boundaries violated.
All right.
That requires courage, though. That's a tough one to face. The fear of being alone is something I think we're inculcated with from a very early age, and it's hard to face that down.
I think it's telling even that we're calling it being alone when what we really mean is not having a sexual and/or romantic partner. It doesn't necessarily mean you are alone.
Yeah, good point.
And I did that too. I mean, I totally used that phrase.
Definitely true. Although I do also want to point out that, like, even before you get to the being alone part, like, breakups suck. Even if you're, I mean, probably people know this, right? If you're breaking up with one person and you still have romantic partners, it still sucks. So, like, that's definitely a loss aversion I think we all face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of people in the poly community that sort of coach on breakups and how to make breakups suck a lot less. So that's always a good thing. Yeah. For yourself and for the community, because when you're I was on a panel on Friday about creating communities based around shared sexual interests, and one of the things is breakups can be bad for the community too, and we should be wary of that. But I think we're going to move on unless anyone has any more comments on the sunk cost fallacy or loss aversion. Nope. All right. So the next fallacy we're discussing is confirmation bias. which is, I think everybody probably has encountered this before. It's generally referred to as, the grandparent of all cognitive biases. And just the Wikipedia defines it as the tendency to search for, interpret, or recall information in a way that confirms one's beliefs or hypotheses. The effect is stronger for emotionally charged issues and for deeply entrenched beliefs. People also tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing position. So how do you guys think confirmation bias plays into our relationships?
Well, I think this is what Franklin was saying. If you go into it with the model of scarcity versus abundance, then you will interpret every breakup or success or refusal within those models. And Franklin's observations, which I'm sure are more extensive than mine because, I don't know anybody, but anyway. No, his observations are that people tend to hold true to those. And I think that's really interesting.
I think this applies a lot to gender roles and dynamics, both in general and especially within relationships. If you sort of expect, men to have commitment issues or women to be passive aggressive, you're probably going to see that everywhere, because one person's commitment issues is another person's preferring to be independent. One person's passive aggression is another person's not being rude and in your face. And I say this as someone who personally hates passive aggression, but for a lot of people, that's their version of politeness. So, I think a lot of it depends on what you sort of expect to see, and then what sort of people you look for to date. If you think that all women are passive aggressive, you might not even be interested in women who are not, because you don't see them as it'll be whoa, they're weird, what's with her? Why is she so direct? I don't like that.
And there's no way that can backfire. There can also be a thing that happens on a more local rather than sort of a general level, where if your experiences with a specific person, for example, somebody you're in your community, if everybody tends to have a negative idea about that person, or if you hear negative stories, you might be less inclined to see them in a positive light than if you hear more positive stories, even though your experiences with that person may contradict what the things that you're hearing about them are. I've observed this happening in small communities like the poly community on many occasions.
So what do you guys think, and if you have any stories or examples about this, of the idea that when we're first really getting to know someone, it's easy to come up with a narrative or a description of their personality based on just sort of our first impression that we then run with, and we interpret everything we see after that as consistent with that first impression that we got.
Well, I definitely think that happens. There's that saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. When you're working from a limited data set, which is really what you're talking about there, you have to draw generalized conclusions from very, very specific and very limited information, and you don't really have a whole lot of other choice about that. So I think you can start building a framework, and then that framework about your understanding of that person starts filtering the new information that comes in, so that you try to fit new information into the idea that you've already built, and it becomes very difficult to be dislodged from that.
I think can also be... Oh, Mary, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think as a bit of a counterpoint, I think that definitely happens, but I've also noticed some counterexamples in my own life. There are some people that I love very, very dearly that I thought were kind of assholes when we met. And to be clear, I don't still think they're assholes. This isn't oh, they're an asshole, but I still love them. No, I actually really, really changed my mind. And I think in some cases it was getting to know the person better and understanding them more. In other cases, it was the person changing, actually. But in any case, it definitely was the case for me that they did get multiple chances to make a different impression, and they did.
Yeah, I also think it can be a strength in that I think if you're somebody who has crushes on someone reasonably soon after meeting them or is interested in them, this is definitely a double-edged sword, but when you start learning things about them, you definitely start putting them in a good light, even if they weren't what matched your checklist before. And I think that can be good in the sense of checklists can be a little bit rigid, but they can also maybe have us settle for people that maybe aren't really compatible with us because we like them so much. On the other hand, in relationships, I think that can be kind of a strength, because if you have like a month of really good times and you have like your first fight, I think it would be good for the confirmation bias to kick in and say, look, things are probably okay. This is probably a person I can get along with. Things have been going well for a month. And not sort of throw it away right away, as we were talking about before.
All right. I think I'm going to skip ahead to a related fallacy, because we sort of touched on it a little bit, especially with your last comment. I'm going to skip ahead to the halo effect, which Wikipedia defines as a cognitive bias in which an observer's overall impression of a person, company, brand, or product influences the observer's behavior, or the observer's feelings and thoughts about the entity's character or properties. It was named by the psychologist Edward Thorndike in reference to a person being perceived as having a halo. Subsequent researchers have studied it in relation to attractiveness and its bearing on the judicial and educational systems. The halo effect is a specific type of confirmation bias wherein positive feelings in one area cause ambiguous or neutral traits to be viewed positively. And it also works the other way, which is called the horns effect. So this, I think, is obviously a little bit related to what we were talking about. So you guys, why don't you see if you have anything to say about that?
I don't know if I experienced this personally because, I mean, I'm not going to get into this, but my whole way of getting interested in people is, I think, kind of weird. However, I wonder if this plays in a lot to people's experiences with NRE, which is new relationship energy, and it's basically just a term for those feelings of when you first start seeing someone and you can't stop thinking about them and you think they're perfect. This is not something that I experienced, so I'm going off of others' experiences. But, you know, like, in those moments for other people, it can feel like even the sort of silly or annoying traits of your partner are actually really adorable or really charming, and then later you sort of realize, like, oh, man, it's actually not that cute that they always leave their socks in little bunches all over the room.
That is definitely something that happens to me, so I can vouch that what Miri's saying is accurate.
I think personally... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can. Okay, thank you. I get crushes easily and often, and this is just, you know, something that happens pretty much all the time with me. And I have had to learn through painful experience that, you know, when I am crushing on somebody, well, maybe, oh gosh, she forgets to feed her fish all the time. That's so adorable. Isn't really the best possible way to look at it. So I have definitely experienced this trap, and it's something that I am consciously aware of, and I have to, you know, sort of consciously make a point of saying, well, actually, no, that's not that adorable.
Yeah, and on the other side, I've been personally working on in my own life. I think I'm really susceptible to the horns effect when I break up with someone. All the things that went wrong, I'm just like, how could I respect them anymore? You know, obviously not with the amicable breakups, but I try not to think poorly of them as a person, but I just don't know how I could possibly be friends with them. And there's no obligation to be friends with an ex, but I think, as we talked about, there is some value in having people who have known you for a long time. And so I've definitely been working on thinking, well, there was a reason I liked them in the first place. Just because we're not compatible doesn't mean they're a bad person. But I think, just like Franklin said, with the halo effect, it takes conscious effort to think about what facts about what you like or don't like about someone are specific to the relationship that you two have, and what are facts about them more generally, or you more generally.
I think what Chana is talking about is also an example of like a related effect, which is the sour grapes effect, which is like you really wanted something and then you couldn't get it or it didn't work out, and now it sucks. I experience this usually when like men shout at me on the street and I'm sexy and I'm beautiful, but then I ignore them and then they're like, "You're ugly, you bitch," and I'm like, "Whoa, you're a sour grape thing really hard right now." But it can also happen in relationships, and I think like this is a really clear example of how cognitive biases, as annoying as they are, can be really adaptive, because it really, really hurts to know that you've lost someone that is really, really great and special. So if your brain just sort of convinces you that they're not that great after all, it's a lot easier to deal with the breakup. But as Chana points out, sometimes that conflicts with some of our other ideals or goals.
Yeah, and I know this tends to affect me in a couple of ways. The first was, as Miri was saying before, when I really like someone, I will overlook glaring flaws. And this, I've noticed this effect just in how attractive I see a person physically, I will start interpreting their other behaviors in a more favorable light and have to actively remind myself that this is going on and that I should pay more attention. The other thing, the horns effect sometimes comes up for me in troubling ways when dealing with metamors. And I know for anyone watching who's not polyamorous, metamors are your partner's other partners. And a lot of times I'm dealing with a very limited amount of information that's going through multiple filters. So I have just very limited information I'm working with, and it's also coming from a partner who's characterizing the behavior, and it's someone I don't really know very well. And a lot of times I'll get an impression of someone as negative, and then I have trouble shaking that later.
My metamors tend to be good friends of mine, so it doesn't happen for me in that situation, but I really do that sometimes with, like, friends, partners, and I feel really bad about it. But, like, I'll hear all these stories that are like, oh, they don't really want me to go out with my friends, or they didn't like that I was wearing that, and I'm like, what?
Right, and the kind of stuff you hear about is the negative stuff, because that's,
Yep.
you know, they just want to complain, and they don't tell you about the corresponding nice things they did and how they apologized for it later and how they worked it out. They just said, oh, we're fine now. You say, well, oh, how good? Why?
And then it sounds to me like the reason they're saying they're fine is because of all these biases and that they've sort of, like, convinced themselves to be okay with it because they want the relationship to go on. But that's also not fair to my friends. Like, I shouldn't just assume that they didn't work it out, you know, in some sort of, like, open and productive way.
Do any of you have
that's really writ large. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, because I was going to go on to a different topic. So if you want to keep on
okay.
Go for it.
I was going to say that idea is really sort of writ large in this entire social construction that, you know, women only like bad guys and they friend zone nice guys or whatever it is the hell that people think they do. You know, because there's this sort of idea that, well, if I have a female friend and she comes to me and she wants to blow off steam about something that's happening in her relationship or her boyfriend did that thing with the socks or whatever, then I'm like, oh, well, this proves that this guy's a monster. I mean, what kind of demon leaves his socks on the kitchen counter, right? And so obviously she's with this guy who's a total monster. That must mean that women only want to date bad guys because, you know, I'm a nice guy. I don't do that thing with my socks. And so you see this sort of play out until it becomes like this cultural archetype.
Franklin is describing me in my teenage years. That is exactly the sort of thing I would end up thinking about every time I had a crush on a girl or a boyfriend, and she would say, like, the tiniest thing he did, I'd be like, oh, monster! How could you possibly? God. But I think that is a really good point that a lot of the rhetoric around this, oh, girls only like assholes, is this absolutely horns effect, where they take the flimsiest of evidence and construct this whole negative persona around a person who just ends up getting demonized.
This has definitely happened to me, and I think it's like a pretty serious moral obligation that if you're someone's confidant and you're giving them advice about their relationship and you have some kind of vested interest, that you really take care to leave your feelings out of it, that you don't sort of hint that they would be better off without them or emphasize, like, tell me more about these awful things they did. By all means, more stories, right? Like, I think it's definitely your obligation not to do that and to be as balanced as possible. I was wondering if anyone had the experience of being haloed. So when I was in college, sometimes guys would have crushes on me, and I would feel like they were not taking seriously any of my flaws. Like, every time I said something negative about myself, they'd be like, oh, that's really cute. Or like, oh, it's so cool that you do all these things. And I'd be like, I'm not actually that perfect. And it would just terrify me because as soon as they find out, then I'm not going to be shiny and interesting anymore. But
yes.
Yeah.
This happens to me a lot. And of course, like, I can't necessarily prove that it happens because how do I know, like, whose impression of me is accurate? I, as someone who's struggled with depression for years and years, I sort of have an overinflated sense of my own flaws sometimes. But at the same time, when someone starts telling me things like, oh, I don't think I deserve you, I don't even understand what I have to offer you, you're already so great at all these things, and I don't really have, and I'm like, really though? Really though? Like, I feel like I'm supposed to take that as a compliment, but what I actually take as a compliment is like a balanced and unbiased and fair and kind view of who I am, not this overblown being put on a pedestal thing. That's not a compliment, that's just awkward.
Franklin, have you ever been haloed?
I have, in one of my relationships, actually, I had started dating somebody in Atlanta, and then, where were we? We were spending the night together at her place, I think, and I left the bathroom seat up, and she was like, "Oh my God, you left the bathroom seat up. You're not perfect." And, you know, it was this thing, because up until then I had been like the archetype of the perfect boyfriend, right? And so it became a thing not just because of the bathroom seat, but because when she started to get a realistic assessment that, you know, I am not this, you know, poly author who is the perfect partner, this was a disappointment, I guess, or, you know, I can't really say what was going on in her head, but it became a thing because now all of a sudden I'm a human being and not an archetype of an ideal boyfriend, and that was a little weird, actually.
Sure.
All right. Anyone have any more thoughts on the halo or horns effect, or should we move on?
More biases.
All right.
Bring them on.
We're gonna go. This is one of my favorites. This is the contrast effect. Wikipedia says the contrast effect is an enhancement or diminishment relative to normal of perception, cognition, or related performance as a result of successive, immediately previous, or simultaneous exposure to stimulus of lesser or greater value in the same dimension. And they give an example where a neutral gray target will appear lighter or darker than it does in isolation when immediately preceded by or simultaneously compared to, respectively, a dark gray or light gray target. Another example is that a person will appear more or less attractive than that person does in isolation when immediately preceded by or simultaneously compared to, respectively, a less or more attractive person. So I think this comes into play in our relationships in huge ways, but I'll let you guys take it away to start with.
I think as a sort of really sad example, I see this happen a lot in cases of abuse, and I have a theory that you know, a lot of people have pointed out that often survivors of abusive relationships tend to keep having abusive relationships. And I wonder, I mean, I think that there can be many reasons for that, such as certain types of people being targeted by abusers. But I think one reason also that it might happen is because when you've been in a really, really horrific relationship, maybe one with physical abuse, which we tend to consider as being quote-unquote worse than other types of abuse, if you then end up in a relationship where the person never hits you, never physically controls you, but they are very emotionally, sort of psychologically abusive, you might see that as awesome because you're not being hit, you're not being locked in the house, you're not having all your money taken away. And I think that's awful, and this is an example of how biases, even though they were originally meant to be adaptive, can really, really screw us over.
I think it can also, I guess to provide a counterpoint, I think there can also be a benefit. I mean, I've definitely had in fact, multiple instances of 2 subsequent relationships where the first one really sucked, or just had some deep flaws, including, for instance, my first ever, because I didn't know what to expect, followed by a really, really supportive person. And I think it was really great, not that I'm glad I had the bad relationship, but that it was really great to see sort of what I deserved or what a better model was, and to be especially appreciative of that because I didn't take it for granted. And I think it could also help if you've sort of...
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, just finish the sentence. Even if you've had even one really helpful, open, productive relationship, that can be your standard in the future, and that can be sort of protective in a way.
Yeah, I've seen this come into play. I've written about this before, and I call it the Kirkeslager effect. I've named it after one of my partner's previous boyfriends, who was just had such poor communication skills that it drove her completely crazy. She would be, he just wouldn't respond to text messages or IMs. Trying to make plans with him was a nightmare. So then the next guy she dated just demonstrated sort of normal, basic communication skills, but to her it was amazing. It was this fantastic display of caring and competence, and it was, she just way overvalued it just because the person she'd seen before was so bad at it.
That's kind of getting into what I call game changer relationships, which are relationships that are so absolutely fantastic in some dimension or in several dimensions that they really make you reevaluate what you want your relationship life to look like. They're relationships that really change everything about what you want from that point on. And it's possible that a part of what makes a game changer is that if there's something that you are not having in your relationship life, or there's some way that a partner is not a good fit for you, and then you learn what it can be like to have that thing or to have a compatible partner, it totally changes everything. It changes your entire framework about how you think about relationships and what's possible.
Game Changer by Franklin Veaux will be available in 2015 from Thorntree Press.
I wonder, I guess the bias probably has a lot to do with things being relatively close in time or space. But I really like the idea of something that's such a game changer that it's not just the next relationship that gets affected, but it's all the subsequent ones that you see in that light.
All right, any more thoughts on the contrast effect? All right, we're going to move on to the fundamental attribution error, which is in social psychology. It is people's tendency to place an undue emphasis on internal characteristics to explain someone else's behavior in a given situation, rather than considering external factors. It does not explain interpretations of one's own behavior, where situational factors are more easily recognized and can thus be taken into consideration. The flip side of this error is the actor-observer bias, in which people tend to overemphasize the role of a situation in their behaviors and underemphasize the role of their own personalities. So basically, the fundamental attribution error suggests that people tend to view their own behavior as just reasonable given the circumstances, and view other people's behavior as somehow indicative of their fundamental character. So what do you guys think about that?
I would say this is the granddaddy of all of the cognitive biases that we have with respect to other people. Like, that guy cut me off in traffic because he's such an asshole. I cut that other guy off in traffic because the sun was in my eyes. This is, this is classic of this kind of fundamental cognitive bias. And when this gets loose in relationships, man, it can really mess you up, because you start interpreting everything that your partner does in the worst possible light. They're doing this thing with their socks because they're a bad person. I'm doing this thing with my socks because I was really sleepy and wanted to go to bed. And boy, when you start elevating yourself and seeing your partner in a bad light that way, man, that starts getting toxic really fast.
Definitely, and I think something I definitely wanted to bring up in this conversation. It's interesting, we've focused on, I think, broader, like, finding relationships and relationship structures in general, but less on what you do when you're in one. And I think what the fundamental attribution error warns us is like one of those geek social fallacies, which is, it is so easy to look at a list of cognitive biases and says, God, I'm so glad I have a list of what everyone else has been doing wrong this whole time. Spectacular. And if you start saying, to your partners that they are subject to all of these biases, rather than, or even equal in looking to yourself, that sounds like a problem. Like, I think with all things, but especially relationships, anti-bias approaches should be really primarily focused on yourself and making yourself better at communicating. Otherwise, it's a disaster waiting to happen.
All right, well, so how do you guys think that we should be guarding against this fundamental attribution error in our relationships?
I feel like it would help a lot if we had like resources to help us do this. Like in my own sort of mental health whatever, I found certain like workbooks and worksheets and exercises really useful. And there are people who are working on developing these sorts of materials for like rationality in general. But sometimes they're sort of plagued by a lot of like in-group language, or just inaccessible for various other ways. But it would be really cool if there was, for instance, like a journaling exercise to help you figure out like, you know, where your perception of like what's going on might be biased.
In my own life, I'm really lucky that my current partner is like really good at relationship stuff, and so I sort of can't help, like even if my brain's being as silly as possible and saying like he does this stuff because he's mad at me or because he doesn't like me anymore or whatever, like it ends up never being true. Like not even like it was once true, so maybe it's true again. It's never true that he does things that annoy me because he doesn't like me or because he doesn't care. And so I think that's bludgeoned my brain at least into recognizing that in future events.
Yeah, I started to become aware about the time of the end of my marriage that one of the things that I would do is I would tell myself stories about the motivations of my partners. And, you know, I realized that, well, actually the magical mind-reading ruby that I keep in my forehead really doesn't work very well. And if I want to understand another person's motivations, the only way that I can realistically do that is to talk to them about it. And, you know, when I'm making up stories about what motivates them, oh, you know, she's doing the thing with the socks because she's such a terrible person and she doesn't like me and doesn't care about my needs, I'm actually simply projecting my own sets of fears onto my partner. So what I've started doing is sort of mentally watchdogging myself and catching myself when I start telling stories about other people's behavior and actually going to them and saying, well, why did you do this instead? And the side effect of doing that sort of constant watchdogging of myself and saying, oh, this is a story I'm telling, this is a story I'm telling, is you become aware of how common it is, how we constantly go about life making up stories to explain the behavior of other people around us without really even consciously being aware that that's what we're doing. And when you become aware of that, it's a little frightening.
Yeah,
really
one of the...
Oh yeah, go for it.
Oh, so one of the things that I think Franklin's absolutely right, that a big way to get around this fallacy is to ask people for their own motivations. But I just caution that most people are not used to that. Because I do this all the time. I'm constantly asking people why they did things, and people have, you know, so many different motivations that can all come together to influence a single action. And getting to what all those are or what the important ones are is sometimes difficult. And you know, if it's not someone who already knows you care about them and already knows that you are just trying to understand and you have good intentions, like this can come off as really aggressive. And like you're saying you don't believe them, or that you're trying to force your own narrative on them when really you're just trying to understand. So I think it's something that should definitely be done, but should be done delicately.
Yeah, I think something I've been struggling with lately in both relationships and friendships and acquaintanceships in general is this idea of people sort of not exactly being upfront about their motivation for something. So for instance, people will give me unsolicited advice, and the sort of text of this is, I am offering you help, but the subtext often is, I need you to take my advice so that I feel good about having given you something useful. So predictably, when I reject their advice, no matter how politely I do so, they get really upset because they weren't clear with me or with themselves about what they really wanted. What they really wanted was to feel useful, was to feel that I needed them, was to feel that they were giving me something. So when I ask people something like, you know, I notice you're always trying to carry things for me, or you're always trying to help me with things when I didn't ask, what do you think makes you do that? They will say something, well, I just want to help you. I just want to be nice. Why don't you appreciate that? They're not going to even realize necessarily that they're doing it because they want some sort of affirmation, and even if they do realize it, they might not want to say so.
Definitely, and I think one of the strategies I use when I either can't ask or don't want to ask or asking won't help, connect to one of these other rationalist principles, which is charity, right, is being charitable. And so I think this is really similar to what Franklin said, that when someone does something, now sometimes, as Miri points out, like, the reasons aren't good. There's no reason to sugarcoat under the guise of charitability something that is bad. But when I don't know and there is reasonable doubt, then something that I've been trying to get better at is when something happens that upsets me, I think, like, what are reasons that this could have happened that don't paint me in a totally virtuous light and the other person in a totally bad light? Like, why might they have left their socks on the kitchen counter? Was it really just to piss me off? Like, are other people that concerned with pissing me off? Probably not. Like, there was probably a reason. I don't know what that would be. Maybe they like to toast their socks in the morning so they're warm. But, like, there's probably a reason.
Yeah, assuming good intent definitely seems like a positive relationship skill. In absence of, any other explanation for why somebody did something, assume good intent, not bad intent.
Or just, like, neutral intent, right? Like, it didn't occur to them to do. I don't know. I think we're less agenty in general than we think we are. We don't always make decisions for reasons. We just do things, and then they become very prominent in other people's narratives of us, whereas to us they may feel totally offhand.
So do you guys have any strategies for telling the difference between when somebody is just doing something due to circumstances and when somebody is doing something because that's a part of their character and that's who they are?
I try to look for patterns. So, like, in relationships, so backtrack a little. So the usual examples that are given with fundamental attribution error are, like, strangers. So, like, oh, someone cut you off in line, that must mean they're an asshole. But the nice thing is that in relationships, we do have, like, a lot more data to fall back on. So if my partner does something and I'm being tempted to sort of write that off as, like, oh, well, they're just insert adjective here, I try to be like, well, if they were insert adjective here, how would I know? So, like, what evidence would there be? What might have been happening? What might they have already said? What patterns would there have been? And if I'm kind of coming up with nothing, then I'm like, okay, so maybe the fact that they just snapped at me for no apparent reason was not because they're a snappish person, but because today is a shitty day.
Yeah, I think patterns are probably what does tend to separate the one-off circumstances-based action from the character action, unless somebody faces the same or similar circumstances a lot, and then you can start seeing that pattern and commit the same error. The other thing, of course, is to watch out for confirmation bias, where if you're looking for patterns, you're more likely to see patterns, and maybe that pattern's not really there in the first place.
Yeah, this is subject to. I feel like I always do this to you, Franklin. By all means, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, I
was going to say this is where my colors as a sort of a pragmatist come through. In a lot of ways, when we're talking about romantic relationships as opposed to interacting with strangers driving on the road or whatever, it might not be the most important thing what somebody's motivations are. It might be a question of, this thing bothers me. Is this a deal breaker for me? Yes or no?
Are you trying to say intent isn't magic?
Yeah, if I'm in a relationship with somebody who keeps doing something and I cannot live with that, her motivations for doing it may not be the most important thing on the table here. I may have to decide, is this actually a compatible relationship partner? Can I be in a relationship with somebody who does this, whatever it is, regardless of what the motivation is?
Yeah, I think that's a big point, is that I don't know if it's really fundamental attribution error, but it's the idea that choosing a partner isn't a moral decision. And leaving someone isn't the same as saying they're a bad person. So what Franklin was saying, when we notice something that we can't live with, and we might have to leave for that reason, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't do it. It just means that it's not something that is good for us.
On the other hand, I mean, if something's not that important to somebody, then it might be easier for them to change or fix to suit your needs. And it's probably really helpful to know that as best you can going in, right? If you're about to say, hey, this random thing you do that doesn't matter to you, could you change it? That's a very different conversation than this thing that's very central to who you are as a person. Could you consider changing it? And so using data to be as sensitive as possible to those kinds of things.
I've had difficulty with that because sometimes people who are already dealing with a little bit of insecurity will then like take that thing and then use it as evidence that they are bad, or because they didn't know that you didn't like that, or because, you know, whatever. But yeah, in general, it's definitely easier to have that conversation when it's not something central. I would just say beware of people suddenly making it central, and also beware of doing the same thing if you're on the other side of that.
Yeah, there's a little problem that can come up, though, if that becomes a tool of emotional manipulation or blackmail. Mm-hmm. Like if you say, I can't be with you if you do this thing with your socks, but you're saying it with the expectation, not that this is a conversation, not that you're giving the other person a choice about, you know, where their priorities are, but the subtext is, and therefore I expect you to change. It can sort of tip over into that emotional blackmail kind of, you know, I'm going to leave you if you don't do exactly what I say you do, what I want you to do kind of conversation. And I want to really kind of steer away from that in my life because I don't like the idea that I might manipulate or control a partner. That's something that's really abhorrent to me. So.
Yeah, this is really tricky, and this is why I've sometimes stayed away from telling people when the honest thing is, I will have to break up with you if you don't stop this. I haven't said that because I didn't want them to feel like they were being manipulated, or I didn't want them to sort of like make an effort to do the thing just so that I didn't dump them, even though it was like really inconvenient for them or really against like who they are, or just gonna fall to pieces later. On the other hand, I don't know, like if that's the truth and that's what I need in a relationship and I'm not getting it, maybe I do need to be honest about that.
Yeah, I sort of start, I guess I have a progressive way of communicating about it. I sort of start at, this bothers me when you do this, or I don't like when you do that. And for most things, that's all the communication they need. If it's not important to them, they just won't do it, or they won't do it to me. If it is something that is a deal breaker, if it continues, I will communicate that eventually before it gets to that point. But I will try to do it in the least pressuring way possible, and make sure that people know that I will totally not blame them if they decide that what they need to do is more important than continuing the relationship.
This can definitely also be overdone, but I find just for my own, the way that I deal with emotional issues, I find it very comforting to be with partners wherein I can tell them the Grimm's fairy tale stories I've been telling myself, with the caveat that I know that they're probably not accurate. But like as Franklin was saying about these stories, like I can say like, I know this isn't true. There's no way this is true. But when you do this thing, what comes to my brain is you're doing it because you don't like me, which I know doesn't make sense. Can we talk about how I can think about it better? Which is not something you can always do, especially if you're talking to somebody who's emotionally vulnerable or has certain types of MI or some kinds of anxiety. Like that can be totally pressuring. But when done with trust and good intent, I think can be really helpful.
That is really useful for me, Chana, because one of my things is that, like, I need a lot of space and independence, and sometimes I start perceiving things as being controlling or manipulative when they were definitely not intended to be. And I sort of have to be careful here because the whole thing about manipulating people is that you don't do it usually overtly. But when I have a really good track record with someone, and I know that, like, this is probably not what they're doing, I can be like, look, here's my problem. And I present it as sort of like collaborative thing, like, I need your help to help me figure this out. When you, whatever it is, offer to help me all the time, I feel like I'm being told that I'm not capable of doing it on my own, but I know that you think I'm capable. I just need your help, like, perceiving this thing somehow. And sometimes they'll just be like, oh, well then I won't keep offering you help if it makes you feel that way. or they'll try to explain it from their point of view. They'll be like, well, you know, the way I was raised, like, this is how we show that we care for someone. It definitely doesn't mean, like, I know you're really capable, you're really good at blah, 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 and then, like, that can really help. But there does have to be that really strong backbone of trust, and I have to be pretty certain. This is when I've already decided that I'm being irrational, but sometimes deciding that you're irrational doesn't stop you from having the bad feelings that are interfering with the relationship. That's, I think, something that we sometimes skip over, like, oh, understand that you're doing cognitive bias. Stop doing it. Feel good.
So one of the places that I see the fundamental attribution error pop up a lot is in text-based communications. We don't have a lot of different models for these kind of communications. They're kind of new. I mean, text message has been around a while. I am a little shorter. But our standard models of communications are all based on in-person communication. And I see a lot of people interpreting other people's text-based communications in really questionable ways that don't really take into account the medium, or that they don't know what's going on the other end of that device. That they may be in the car trying to text, even though they shouldn't be. They may be in the middle of something and just need to shoot off something real quick and don't have time to give a full explanation. And I see a lot of that not being taken into account. So I think that's a big place where the fundamental attribution error comes into account, and people tend to ignore that what people do has a lot to do with their circumstances.
So I wrote a whole blog post about this once because I prefer text-based communication, so it was sort of a post about my own experiences and suggestions for ways to streamline it and make it better. And the thing that you're talking about, Wes, I've started to realize that it is really a double-sided thing, because on the one hand, we need to work on perceiving things more reasonably, but on the other hand, if someone gives you so little information, like, you don't know where they are, you don't know what they're doing, and it's also can be kind of dangerous to just assume every single time, like, oh, the reason this sounds so fucking rude is because they must be really busy right now. So I think some of it is on us to use, the cues that we've developed, like smileys or whatever, or maybe wait until a better time to answer the text, because I think we often feel like, because it's always on and it's so immediate, we need to answer it right now even though we're really busy. No, it can probably wait a little bit. Because unlike with the reason I have difficulty with verbal communication sometimes is because I'm not given the time that I need to think of how I want to word this. And I also have to constantly be watching my tone and watching my body language, and I've learned that my tone and body language is not standard in some ways, so I have to consciously force it to be the way that people are familiar with, which is really, really fucking hard. So text allows me to actually think, wait, is this the way that I want to say this? Is this the best way of getting my intended message across? So just a counterpoint.
There's a funny thing that happens with text messaging or, similar low bandwidth communication that seems like we get the fundamental attribution error and issues about scarcity or abundance and confirmation bias and all of these other things sort of nicely wrapped up in this package of suck. So you'll have people say, well, I just texted this person that I have a crush on and it took her 8 minutes to reply. What does that mean? Does that mean she doesn't like me? And you don't even think about, well, no, maybe it means that she's in traffic and it's really not a good idea for her to text back. And then we attach all these expectations to it, like I have an expectation that if I text somebody that I am into, that they should respond right away, right? And, an expectation on my part does not mean an obligation on somebody else's part. And that's where we really have to be careful. A, not to project these ideas based on really scanty evidence. B, to assume that, maybe they're not texting back because they are on the road or they're doing something else. And C, assume good intent. Don't try to read something negative in how long it takes them to text or how many words long their reply was or anything like that.
Yeah, going on what Miri said, I think you're totally correct that It is sometimes not a good idea to just make assumptions about why someone did the thing they did or why they said the thing they did, and then try to excuse bad behavior that way. But what I try to do when somebody is not communicating well, or verbosely, we'll say, and I don't know where they are or what they're doing, I will just try to reserve judgment until later when I can ask them. You can say, okay, when we were talking before, what was going on? When they might have more time to give an explanation. So that's sort of how I try to counteract this, is just reserving judgment until an appropriate time when I can get more information to inform that judgment. I don't know if you guys have any other strategies.
I'm like terrible at this. Like, I don't know that I will ever be able to convince myself that someone not texting me means something bad, including people I've been with for a really long time. So this is like my unique trouble. And I think in that case, one of the things I do is I kind of give myself permission to be irrational. Like, I stop beating myself, like, I know it's irrational, and then I stop beating myself up for being so irrational. I like acknowledge that it's not true. I try not to text like 17 times in a row saying, where are you? But then I say, like, it's okay to feel really bad about this. As long as you don't impose it on anyone else, like, you can go into your room and feel like someone doesn't like you because they didn't text you for 8 minutes. That is your prerogative. The way I put this, which Miri has heard before, is no feelings about feelings, which is my goal, although I don't impose this on anyone else, is not to beat myself up for the feelings that I'm having.
My usual way of dealing with this is honestly to just like ignore it and distract myself, which doesn't work for everyone but can work really well for me. And this is a strategy that a lot of people think is bad, especially people sort of in my field and orientation, so it's mental health and therapy, where this is idea that like, no, you need to like excise the irrational thoughts and replace them with good adaptive thoughts that make you feel good. And I'm like, okay, well, after having depression for God knows how many years, I don't know that I'm ever going to be like, oh, this person's not texting me back. They're probably having an awesome time and will get to me as soon as they can. Like, that's probably never going to be what my mind goes to, and that's okay. So I adapt to my own irrationality by choosing behaviors that help it make it easier to bear. So, like, I'm going to go watch TV now. I'm going to go talk to my friends now.
I do exactly the same thing.
And there's also... I'm sorry. There's a flip side of the same thing, too, which is when you're the person who hasn't answered for 8 minutes, you know, talk about that, too. Like, I will never answer a text when I'm driving. I just won't. I won't even look at my text messages when I'm in the car. So when I get where I'm going, I'll say, oh, I was in the car. I'm sorry I didn't text you back right away. You know, I don't text from the car. What can I do for you? Or, you know, how can I help talk to you or give you the attention you need or whatever.
And that's where those previous conversations built on trust and honesty are really helpful, because if you know what it is that's causing someone anxiety about not texting them back or whatever behavior. So if you've had a conversation about behaviors that are upsetting to your partner, and because you're human and you're fallible, you do them again, you can better target your either apology or explanation to what causes them anxiety. No, I wasn't ignoring your text. Absolutely not. I was in the car. Versus for somebody else, like, no, I wasn't doing something I didn't tell you about. I was in the car, or whatever the anxiety-producing idea happens to be.
All right. Any further thoughts on the fundamental attribution error? All right. We're going to move on to the mere exposure effect, which is a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop a preference for things merely because they are familiar with them. In social psychology, this effect is sometimes called the familiarity principle. The effect has been demonstrated with many kinds of things, including words, Chinese characters, paintings, pictures of faces, geometric figures, and sounds. In studies of interpersonal attraction, the more often a person is seen by someone, the more pleasing and likable that person appears to be. So what do you guys think? How does that affect the relationships that we have?
I think, well, most people tend to develop relationships with people that are somehow in proximity to them. So usually we think of this being geographically because you're seeing them all the time. But in our case, for some of us, it can also be online. Like if you're always interacting with someone online, You can develop sort of positive feelings to them from that. For me, I have a really extreme version of this, which is that I literally only become attracted to, interested in, whatever, in people that I'm already pretty good friends with. Otherwise, I just don't give a fuck. Like, sorry, I just don't. I need to, like, actually know you as a person in order to even, like, see you sexually or romantically or anything. And this one is weird because in the case of relationships, I don't know that I would even call this a bias. I think for me personally, I would call this pretty smart because relationships tend to work better when you already know the person and there's like some amount of trust and mutual respect there. I know some people are really into the love at first sight thing. Not really for me.
Yeah, I just think the dangerous side of it is that trust, we can develop that trust. That's not actually based on people behaving in a trustworthy manner. A lot of times it can just be the mere exposure to that person makes us trust them more. If we've seen them a number of times, then we will trust them more than a person we've seen once, even though they haven't actually done anything that shows that they're trustworthy. So to me, that's where I like to watch out for this sort of thing. And I think that applies a lot to our relationships, that just because we've known someone or seen someone for many times or for a period of time, we will view them more favorably. That's not based on what they've done in that time. It's just the exposure.
Yeah, that is actually a really good point. So I will amend what I said, because what you're saying brings to mind what happens when someone in like a social circle or a community is accused of sexual assault or really anything else bad. And then everyone comes out of the woodwork all like, what? But we get dinner together every week. He goes to my board game parties every weekend. Like, she's so awesome. I hang out with her all the time. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but none of that actually disconfirms what was just said.
Yeah, that's actually one of the first things I thought of when I read about this, was that in our communities, when somebody's accused of something, that people will defend them just based on the exposure and not on anything having to do with how trustworthy they are.
I guess it's not as salient for me. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen someone decided that I probably wouldn't be interested in them and like changed my mind. Like, I usually have an inkling at first, like, this is somebody that like maybe I could develop a crush on if the following things were to happen. So I don't think I've ever had that experience. It's a really interesting idea to think that you could be sort of totally not interested in someone, but by getting in the stronger form, getting to know them better, in the weaker form, just being around them, you could develop an interest. I find that really alien, but works for other people, sure.
I'm the opposite of you in that regard. I've definitely met people and they've just been like, no, no. And then, like, 2 years later, we're in a serious relationship and we're in love. Obviously, that's not, like, the most common case, though. Usually, I'm like, no, and then nothing ever happens. But I think that's more because, you know, I do have a pretty good... It depends on, like, why I had that reaction. If it's because I don't find them physically attractive, that I can change my mind on really quickly, because that's not really, like, what my attraction is based on. But if it's because... I don't know, they're a sexist asshole, then I'm probably, no amount of seeing them is going to make that any better for me.
All right, Franklin, do you have anything to add on the mere exposure effect?
Yeah, I'm actually, I think, more in Chana's boat here on this, because it's not really consistent with my own personal experience either. Like, you know, I can get an idea about whether or not I find somebody interesting fairly quickly, but I have not actually found in my own personal life that you know, exposure to somebody that I'm disinterested in makes me more interested in them. Although I will say there have been people that I've been exposed to and I've been interested at first, and then I learned things about them that caused me to become less interested. But that's really not quite the same animal at all.
All right. Well, we'll move on to our next bias, which is the neglect of probability, which is a type of cognitive bias and is the tendency to completely disregard probability when making a decision under uncertainty, and is one simple way in which people regularly violate the normative rules for decision making. Small risks are typically either neglected entirely or hugely overrated. The continuum between the extremes is ignored. And this isn't something that's really obvious for the way it affects our relationships. But when I read this, I immediately thought of the way a lot of people talk about trust. And it's the idea that we tend to view people as, oh, I trust that person, or I don't trust that person. And when really the amount we trust a person should be on some kind of continuum, and it's a probability that they're being honest. It's not a binary. It's not a yes or a no. And I wanted to ask if you guys have any experiences with that.
I do definitely think it's true that people tend to base trust on this sort of binary on or off sort of thing. That can create a problem in small communities particularly, but it can create problems where, so there's a situation that happened several years ago in Portland in the BDSM community where there was a person who was really prominent in the community who sexually assaulted a friend of mine. And a bunch of people came out of the woodwork and they said, well, I've never had a problem with him. I can trust him. Well, yeah, because you're not in his target demographic. So you are taking your own personal experience of trust with this person and you're applying it to a situation where it's wildly inappropriate. And we need to be able to have more of a sense of, well, all right, the way this person behaves toward me is not necessarily indicative of how they behave toward other people.
All right, and Miri, I just wanted to ask, what is are we going to 2:20 or 2:30?
2:30.
Okay.
So
All right.
I'm going to see if there are any questions from the chat room now, but if not...
Okay. Chana, do you have any thoughts about how our neglect of probability can influence our relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's connected to one of those fallacies.
Did we lose Chana?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay.
Let's see if she comes back.
Okay.
Oh.
Oh, wait. There you are. Chana, I think we missed your comment there.
You're okay. I thought I'd been here the whole time, but that's all right. Because I heard you guys saying that you'd lost me, and I was like, no.
Oh no, we've lost you again.
Am I with you?
Now I can hear you. No?
I think we lost her.
Yeah.
All together.
All right, I think we have you back. No. All right. Well, let's move on to normalcy bias, and we'll see if Chana can rejoin us for that discussion. Normalcy bias is the mental state people enter when facing a disaster. It causes people to underestimate both the possibility of a disaster occurring and its possible effects. This may result in situations where people fail to adequately prepare for a disaster, and on a larger scale, the failure of governments to include the populace in its disaster preparations. The opposite of normalcy bias would be overreaction or worst-case thinking bias, in which small deviations from normality are dealt with as signaling of an impending catastrophe.
I think the latter one of those is probably more applicable to relationships in that, not that people necessarily, well, I think some people do, like, over-predict how likely it is that their partner is going to break up with them, but leaving that aside, just this idea of, like, a breakup would be a total disaster and my life would just be over and I'll never meet anyone ever again, when in fact, like, they've probably dealt with breakups before and it does suck, but it doesn't suck quite that much.
And that plays into what we were talking about before, where people will remain in a relationship because the fear of being alone is worse than the relationship is, even though the relationship is not a good one.
Yeah, I think there is a real tendency of people to view even smaller changes than a breakup to their relationship as being this horrible disaster and this total catastrophe, and that life could never be good again after that happens. Hannah, are you back with us?
I hope so.
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I also think that because we totally discount.
Oh no, poor Hannah.
That could have been the answer to all their problems. And now we'll never know.
Man. Oh well, sorry audience. We'll have to wait. No.
Maybe.
Alright. Okay. Well, we can move on to omission bias, which is the tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or less moral than equally harmful omissions or inactions, due to the fact that actions are more obvious than inactions. The bias is usually showcased through the trolley problem, which is the idea that if you are faced with an impending trolley that's heading for 5 people who are stuck on the track, and you have a lever that you can switch to make the trolley go hit one person on a different track, whether you should do that or not. And most people's ethical intuitions suggest that no, we should not touch the lever because we can't make that decision to harm that one person. That's wrong, even if it would save 5. And there's a lot of debate about this problem. But it is shown in a lot of the studies and literature that we do see actions as somehow more significant than omissions. And what do you guys think about how that affects how we are in our relationships?
I think there are a lot of... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I wonder if that might account for the fact that some monogamous people have this like arrangement where having sex with other people is okay as long as you don't talk about it. So the omission of that information is fine, but talking about it or allowing the person to find out the details, that would be what would be quote-unquote cheating or problematic otherwise.
Yeah, that's actually really similar to what I was about to say, that a lot of people will use this idea to rationalize that it's okay to have a lie of omission, but it's not okay to directly lie. And I've seen this play out in monogamous relationships I don't know how many times. I mean, I actually had a friend many years ago who told me point blank that she was cheating on her partner, and I was like, well, how is that okay? And she said, well, I'm not telling him that I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, I think anytime you hear, oh, I wouldn't want to tell them because it would hurt them, I feel like that's a big example of omission bias. And yeah, as Franklin and Miri both said, it's that we tend to view honesty. A lot of people will equate being honest with just not lying to people, which never really made all that much sense to me. But we all almost universally will view lies, actively telling a lie, as worse than just knowing that somebody thinks something that's not true and failing to correct it, even though we know they would want to know. And to me, those are the same thing. But the way we talk about honesty, we tend to view lies as just the worst possible thing and sort of ignore the rest of what's going on.
Yeah, I've never understood that either. In my book, a lie of omission is still a lie of misdirection is still a lie, and these things are precisely morally equivalent to intentionally saying something that you know is false. But that does definitely seem to be a minority view, doesn't it?
All right, well, I think, Miri, have we gotten any questions on the chat room?
We have not. Apparently there was a problem with the chat room and it literally kicked everyone out. So maybe someone will tweet questions at us. I did want to mention to anyone still watching that Chana said that she hung up because the tech was being disruptive, but wanted to say that she really appreciated being part of the panel.
And we really appreciated having her. And I think we are going to wrap up here. It's about 2:30. So I want to thank Chana, if you're still watching. Thanks for being part of the panel. Franklin, thank you. And Miri, thank you for being on the panel and for all the work you've been doing on FtBCon.
Thank you.
It's been really great.
Everyone read Franklin's book. Even if you're monogamous, it'll still give you a lot of useful information.
Yeah, More Than Two is great, and Game Changer will be coming out. Franklin, is it this year?
This year, yes, end of the year.
Okay. All right, I highly recommend both books.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks, everyone.